All right. Thank you. Okay, so we're done with the introduction to ethics. We have clarified some concepts and terms, especially when making valuations. Ang pinaka-importante yung kailangan tandaan every time you hear the word ethics is that it's the application of the notion of good and bad, right and wrong. And there are instances in our life where we apply these notions of good and bad, right and wrong, that are somewhat superficial and not to be considered as part of ethics. But when we're talking about the notion of good and bad, right and wrong, that pertains to ethics, we always have to keep in mind that it should be concerned about the life and well-being of one's own life and that of other people. So let's begin with utilitarianism. Among the four major ethical theories that should be discussed, itong apat na major ethical theories, they are considered to be major precisely because these are the widely recognized moral theories around the world. Yung comment kanina regarding utilitarianism na medyo masama siya kasi you don't have to look at the intention behind, that is somewhat true. Yun yung kritisismo, no? Critic against utilitarianism actually. Pero thought experiment lang yun. Pero hindi natin pwedeng i-disregard na ang mostly ng ating policy makers and politicians are, even though they're not aware of this one, they are mostly utilitarian thinkers, especially when they are thinking about the benefits that a bill or a law could bring to the most number of people. So I would like to begin with a cliche. Napaka-cliche na phrase ito eh. The end justifies the means. How do you understand this sentence? Ano ibig sabihin nito? The end justifies the means. Anyone? Just open your mic and then state your first name. No need to raise your hand kasi hindi ko nakikita kung sino nagre-raise ng hand. The end justifies the means. Ano ibig sabihin nito? Name, please. Hindi ko nakikita kasi yung... Okay. Mhm. May nag-chat ba? Pakibasa. Sino nag-chat? Para hindi ko na ililipat sa Google Meet. Yes, okay. Sino? Name? Okay. Another answer? Different ba sa sinabi ni Jay? Jay ba yung nag... Ano? Yes. Go ahead. Okay. Okay, last one. Sino yun nag-raise ng hand? Just open your mic and state your name. Okay. Okay. Yes, tama 'yun, 'no, pero I would like to recognize the effort, 'no, si Jay ba yung una, um, the last 2 are the correct answers, 'no. Um, so ibig sabihin nun, no matter what the actions were in attaining some goal, justified siya or allowable siya kasi yung goal is good. For example, passing the exam is good, and yun, goal yun. But if you cheat for you to pass the exam, is that good or not? Or does that pertain to this sentence or not? When you cheat to pass the exam, does the end justifies the means? Yes, di ba? Pero masama kasi yung means na cheating. Although good yung pagpasa mo nung subject, masama pa din yung means. So ito yung issue actually, 'no, yung central na issue na binanggit din dun sa video natin kanina. Pero again, it's not that all bad, 'no, yung side ng utilitarianism is not that all bad. You'll see later. Okay, so I would like to give you another case, 'no, case naman ng nangyari dito sa Pilipinas wherein the thought of utilitarianism could be applied. So, basahin ko lang, medyo mahaba. So, bear with me. So, on January 25, 2015, the 84th Special Action Force or SAF conducted a police operation at Mamasapano in Maguindanao. 2015, ilang taon kayo nito? Also known as Oplan Exodus, it was intended to serve an arrest warrant for Marwan, a Malaysian terrorist and bomb maker who had a 5 million bounty, $5 million bounty on his head. So this mission eventually led to a clash between the PNP SAF on the one hand and the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters or BIFF and MILF on the other. So although the police operation was successful because of the death of Marwan, the firefight that ensued claimed 67 lives, including 44 SAF. May magigets nyo na ito. Ito yung usong balita noon, no? Yung kumakalat sa balita. Ang tagal nitong binalita. 44 SAF. Panahon ni Aquino. Troopers, 18 MILF, and 5 civilians. However, the relatively high number of SAF members killed in this operation caught the attention of many, including the Philippine media and the legislature. So nagkaroon ng investigation kasi nagkaroon ng miscommunication between the president, allegedly, no, executive table, uh, giving orders to the PNP at yung backup, no, parang as far as I remember, if my memories serve me right, ang tagal nung backup nung mga SAF troopers na nasa digmaan, 'no, na corner sila, eh. So inaantay nila yung utos mula sa chief, which is during that time is Aquino, passing on the PNP chief. Okay, so in one of the Congress, another long paragraph, bear with me, you can follow through para mabasa nyo din ng mabilis. No? In one of the Congress investigations that followed this tragic mission, then Senate President Drilon and Senator Escudero debated the public hearing of an audio recording of an alleged conversation that attempted to cover up the massacre of the PNP SAF commandos. So Drilon questioned the admissibility of these recordings as evidence under the anti-wiretapping law, whereas Escudero cited the legal brief of the Free Legal Assistance Group, arguing that the anti-wiretapping law protects only the recording and interception of private communications. Ito nagsimula ata ito sa panahon ni Arroyo, itong anti-wiretapping law, no, to yung bang hindi papayagan bilang ebidensya sa korte ang anumang pribadong komunikasyon. Kasi yung line natin, yung mobile phone ninyo, dahil dumaan yan sa gobyerno, meron silang access dyan, no? Kung gugustuhin nila. So Drilon cited Section 4 of the Anti-Wiretapping Act and explained that any communication or spoken word or the existence, content, substance, purport, or meaning of the same or any part thereof, or any information therein contained, obtained, or secured by any person in violation of the preceding sections of this act shall not be admissible in evidence, as evidence rather, dapat ito, in any judicial, quasi-judicial, etc., etc. So, question ni Grace po ito actually, no? Sabi niya, um, sinabi na ni Senator Drilon na ito daw ay illegal, na hindi daw pwede, na ako daw ay pwedeng maging liable kung ito daw ay ipapakinig ko sa Senado, referring to the alleged conversation, no, na attempted to cover up the massacre of the PNP staff. Kasi nandun yung ebidensya ng communication. Paano nangyari yung bakit hindi dumating kagad yung backup or what not, no? The bottom line is makakatulong yun sa proseso, sa investigasyon upang mas malaman, matukoy kung sino yung may fault, no, yung may kasalanan. So, bawal daw, sabi ni Grace po, sinasabi ni Drilon. Sabi naman, ang kinakasya naman ni Grace po is, ano ba itong mga batas na ito? Ang mga batas na ito ay para malaman natin ang katotohanan at magkaroon tayo ng hustisya. Itong mga anti-wiretapping or mga recording na ganito, kung hindi pwedeng ilabas sa publiko, pwede naman gawing basihan sa executive session. So si Drilon kasi, he is against the violation of privacy. No? Pero para saan nga ba hanggang saan ba yung hangganan yung protection natin ng privacy? Pag pinag-uusapan ng for the safety and order of the most number of people, dapat na di-disregard ito, no? According to utilitarianism. So, there's a legal and moral issue concerning the SOF 44, in short na pangalan ng event na unfortunate event. So in the 1987 Philippine Constitution, it does state that it protects a citizen's right to private communication, but there are some exemptions to its inviolability. In other words, pwedeng isang tabi muna itong karapatan na ito when and only when they involve public safety and order. So RA 4200 and RA 9372 amended by the anti-terrorism, yung lately lang na propose na law, both provide exemptions to the inviolability of one's right to privacy. So in instance of treason, espionage, rebellion, and sedition. So putting aside the legal issues, could wiretapping be morally permissible or not morally permissible? So when considering such cases as this, which concerns public safety and order, we should calculate the costs and benefits of wiretapping. So, such calculation of our actions is a practice of an ethical theory that focuses on the consequences of actions as the basis of morality. Again, no matter what your intentions are, as long as you focus on the consequences of the action, that would be the basis of the morality. Such is the case in utilitarianism. So, let's define utilitarianism. Kanina pa natin binabanggit. So, this is actually an ethical theory that argues for the goodness of pleasure and the determination of right behavior based on the usefulness by the word utility from the word utility of the action's consequences. So this means that pleasure is good, that the goodness of an action is determined by its usefulness. Its root word utility refers to the usefulness of the consequences of one's action and behavior. So when we argue that wiretapping is morally permissible because doing so results in better public safety, then we are said to be arguing in a utilitarian way because we focus more disregarding whatever the private conversations that took place, whatever they are, no matter how sexual or whatever, yung private communication na meron para mailabas lang yung ebidensya, para lang ma-provide for public safety, better public safety, then we are said to be arguing in a utilitarian way. So the two foremost utilitarian thinkers of this ethical theory are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Si John Stuart Mill yung papa niya at saka si Jeremy Bentham. They were friends. Kaya si John Stuart Mill at a young age, malabasa ito kasi yan, bookworm siya. No? Ah, natuto rin siya sa kanyang papa, sa kanyang father, who was then, during that time, friends with Bentham. Si Bentham kasi yung talagang original thinker of utilitarianism. Pero sa kanya, according to Mill, medyo sarado yung utilitarian, yung version niya ng utilitarianism. It focuses on quantity alone. Si Mill kasi, sabi niya, hindi lang quantity dapat ang pleasure and pain. You should also consider its quality. More on that later. Just to give you an idea. So, utilitarianism as a consequentialism. So the moral value of actions and decisions are based solely or greatly on the usefulness of their consequences. So in this case, ang utilitarianism is consequentialism. So it focuses more on the consequences, not the motives, not the intentions, not the actions themselves. Just the consequence of the action. So kung gaano man kasama, gaano man parang si Robin Hood. Si Robin Hood nagnanakaw siya actually, di ba? Nagnanakaw siya pero yung ninanakaw niya binibigay niya sa mga mahihirap. So yung stealing na part, yung kanyang action is bad in itself. Pero yung consequence ng kanyang action, which is to help other people, is utilitarian. It's useful for other people. So yung consequence is good and therefore his actions are morally justified. So it is the usefulness of results that determines whether the action or behavior is good or bad. So for both Bentham and Mill, utility refers to a way of understanding the results of people's actions, specifically on the total amount of happiness in the world. Kasi ang pagtingin kasi nitong dalawa sa happiness is more on Yun yung goal kasi, no? Yun yung pinaka-goal actually when we analyze life. Actually, our goal, our end goal is happiness, no? For the long term, not only for momentarily, no? Parang kayo, pumapasok kayo para kayo ay makapagtapos. But gusto niyo makapagtapos? Gusto niyo makapagtapos kasi eventually gusto niyo maging professional, no? Bakit niyo gusto maging professional? Because eventually you want to help your family perhaps, or to have family of your own, to have your own house, your own car, or whatever, no? But the point is, yung end goal natin is happiness. So the consequences of an action, according to utilitarianism, is that it should focus on the total amount of happiness that is possible to be produced, and that is for the most number of people. So, in other words, a utilitarian values pleasure and happiness. Pero kailangan nating i-define kung ano yung pleasure dito, no? Later yan. Kasi madaling sabihin na whatever is pleasurable at the moment is pleasurable always, no? Hindi ganon. More on that later. Okay. Hindi ko babasahin lahat ito, no? Itong sa umpisa lang. So, the principle of utility, this is from Jeremy Bentham. So, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Nothing else. Yun yung tingin ni Bentham, no? Actually, the same with Mill, pero mas broader yung pagtingin niya ng pleasure. So, gumagawa tayo ng actions according to Jeremy Bentham. We do actions that bring us pleasure, and we avoid actions that give us pain. Iba sa inyo magre-react, bakit sir mahal ko pa siya kahit nasasaktan na ako? That's different, no? Uh, because love is unconditional. um, Maybe perhaps mahirap na yung discussion. That's more on love. Pero the point is, we do actions according to these two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. Unless you are sadista, o kaya masokista, na you find pleasure in pain. But mostly naman kasi people do actions that give them pleasure, and they avoid actions that provide them pain. It is for them alone, according to Jeremy Bentham, to point out what we ought to do as well as to determine what we shall do. You can read that later on. In-upload ko ito actually as a PDF. Hindi ko na babasahin ko yan. Yun lang yung point nito. Sa mundo na ating ginagalawan, according to Jeremy Bentham as well as kay Mill, we are governed by pleasure and pain. When you analyze later on, kailangan nyo internalize yan eh. Kailangan nyo nga no? We do actions. Kaya nga pag mas pipiliin ng ibang hindi pumasok, for example, di ba? Because that's pleasure. Kaysa sa makinig sa very boring lecture, tiring lecture, whatnot. No? But that's different. That's momentary pleasure. That's not for long term. Bakit? Because you're a student. Student ka eh. You are obliged to attend classes which can bring you good grades. And by having good grades, you will eventually pass the subject. And when you pass the subject, of course, you will have the possibility of graduating. That is a pleasure for the long term. Happiness. No? Happiness for the long term. Cutting classes is just momentary pleasure, which for according to Mill is not really happiness. So Bentham, no, from the quotation that we read a while ago, equates happiness with pleasure. So Mill supports Bentham's principle of utility. He also clarifies further that what makes people happy is intended pleasure, and what makes us unhappy is the privation of pleasure. So the things that produce happiness and pleasure are good, whereas those that produce unhappiness and pain are bad. Napaka-common sense, no? Pero later, mas lilinaw yung kay Mill. Mas maganda kasi yung version niya kasi he looks into the quality of pleasure. Si Bentham kasi meron pa siyang proposed calculus, no? Philosophic calculus to measure quantifiable pleasure. According to Mill, hindi lang dapat quantity ang tinitignan when we talk about pleasure. We also have to think about the quality of the pleasure. So in the words of Mill, di ko babasahin lahat, first two sentences lang. So the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals, utility or the greatest happiness principle. So this is another term of the principle of utility, no? The greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So by happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain, by unhappiness, pain in the privation of pleasure. So may proof actually si Mill, no? Kasi may critic din sa kanila na sigurado ba kayo na pain and pleasure lang ang pleasure lang ang pinaka-goal ng isang tao? He provides his proof. No? So at the center of the work stands Mill's proof of the principle of utility. So the argument takes place by way of three subclaims. So Mill argues for, first, desirability, that happiness is desirable as an end. Sino ba dito ang ayaw ang happiness? Meron ba sa inyo? Again, unless you are a masochist. Or, pero kahit ang masochista at sadista they still find happiness. They find happiness in pain. Another would be exhaustiveness, that nothing but happiness is desirable as an end. Anything that you do, anything in any intention actually, anything that you plan to do, its desired end is happiness. Try nyo i-analyze. If you have a counter argument against that, tell me now. And lastly, impartiality, that each person's happiness is equally desirable. As you are a citizen of our country and you are living with other people, you are living in a community, you have to keep in mind that everybody's happiness is equally desirable. Because if you think that your happiness is prioritized over the other people's happiness, no, then that would defeat the purpose of principle of utility. So the nature of pleasure and pain. So to identify a criterion for distinguishing pleasures and to calculate the resultant pleasure or pain, this is where the differences lie between Bentham and Mill. So the nature of pleasure and pain. So when Bentham identified as the natural moral preferability of pleasure, Mill refers to as a theory of life. If we analyze, for example, what moral agents do and how they assess their actions, then it is hard to deny the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of pain. So for both Bentham and Mill, pursuit of happiness or pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain are the only principles in assessing an action's morality. So, in other words, yung sinasabi ni Bentham, no, na moral preferability of pleasure for John Stuart Mill, he refers that as theory of life. Because again, if you think about your life is all about gaining happiness, no? Attaining happiness. Kung meron bang um, panandali ang pain, eventually, after overcoming challenges, for example, challenges should be painful, no? Could be painful. For Mill, that is theory of life. In other words, when you think about life, again, it's your actions are all about attaining happiness and avoidance of pain. So why is it justifiable going back to the case scenario we have a while ago? So why is it justifiable to wiretap private conversations in instances of treason, rebellion, espionage, and sedition? So why is it preferable to alleviate poverty or to at least diminish, no? To lessen poverty or to eliminate or to diminish again criminality? Bakit sa tingin ninyo meron tayong Philippine police force? No? Bakit may gustong mag sa batas ng mga polisiya upang protektahan ang ating mga mamamayan? Bakit preferable yun? Why is it noble to build schools and hospitals? Bakit kailangan maging proyekto ng bawat munisipalidad ang pagkakaroon ng eskwelahan at hospital? Why is it, in other words, good to improve the quality of life and the like? When we think about it, it is all because of the principle of utility. Or in other words, to promote happiness and decrease pain. For example, dito sa yung going back sa video natin kanina, baka sabihin ninyo, bakit sir yung example doon parang masama po yung utilitarianism? Again, that's thought experiment. Thought experiment lang yun, no? Uh, i-critique rather, no? I-critique against utilitarianism. But again, we are governed by utilitarianism because most of our policymakers, most of our people in the government are utilitarians, even though they're not aware of it. They are utilitarians. So, for example, you have to build a hospital, tapos kailangan ma-displace yung mga nakatira doon. For example, mga, let's say, mga, I'm looking for the proper term. Pero yung mga squatter, no? For, to use the slang term. Pag may sasantabi sila para makapagtayo ng hospital, anong dapat na gagawin doon? Siyempre, yung ituloy yung pagbi-build ng hospital because that would be the good for all. So, as we talk about pleasure, we ask the question, no, what kind of pleasure is morally preferable and valuable? So, ano ngayon yung kind of pleasure ang morally preferable and valuable? Are all pleasures necessarily and ethically good? Lahat ba ng pleasures, are they the same? If your answer is no, then we have to distinguish what pleasure is more valuable compared to others. If your answer is yes, then how are they all good? Kasi for example, we have excessive practice of pleasure versus temperance or moderation. For example, drinking or eating is pleasurable. Pleasurable siya, no? Pero when talking about the quantity, when excess is brought into the equation, is excessive drinking or excessive eating pleasurable? Definitely no. Momentarily pwede. Momentarily lang. Masaya ka kasi ang dami mong nainom, ang dami mong nakain. Momentarily. Pero when talking about long term, no, nakakasama kaya ang excessive drinking at excessive eating? So, paano natin malalaman ngayon ang pinaka preferable, no? For Jeremy Bentham, he provides a certain calculus, no, to measure if a certain framework to measure what kind of pleasure is preferable. So, in order to determine the moral preferability of actions, Bentham provides a framework for evaluating pleasure and pain, commonly called philosophic calculus. So for Bentham, pleasure can be measured quantitatively through the following criteria. So an action can be evaluated on the basis of intensity or strength, how strong the pleasure is or how intense is it, duration, how long can the experience of pleasure be or how long will it last, certainty, how probable can the pleasure occur, how certain or uncertain is it, propinquity, how soon there will be pleasure or how near or remote. Fecundity, the chance it has of being followed by sensations of the same kind. Purity, the chance it has of not being followed by sensations of the opposite kind. Or, in other words, how free is it from pain? So when considering the number of persons who are affected by pleasure or pain, we also talk about extent, how widely it covers. So these seven rather, no, these seven criteria are used for determining the moral preferability of actions according to Bentham. And he calls this framework as philosophic calculus. So iniisa-isa niya yan, no? Pero according to Mill, medyo hindi mo masusukat actually ang pleasure according to this criteria lang. No? Because pleasure should be experienced and experiences could not be quantified sometimes, no? Cannot be quantified. If you try to quantify experience, then you are not describing the experience that you had. You might be able to describe it, but you will not be able to capture the essence of the experience itself. That would pertain to the quality of pleasure. So this allows for the evaluation of all actions and their resultant pleasure. So actions are evaluated on the single scale regardless of preferences and values. So in this sense, pleasure and pain can only quantitatively differ but not qualitatively differ from other experiences of pleasure and pain accordingly. So quantitatively lang, no, kay Jeremy Bentham. And this was a critique of Neil against Bentham na nakalimutan niya yung quality element of pleasure. Kasi for Mill, sabi niya, utilitarianism cannot promote the kind of pleasures appropriate to pigs or any other animals. Kasi when we talk about the philosophic calculus lang, no, the quantity only, you can talk about any pleasure, actually, no? Pero according to Mill, hindi mo pwedeng i-justify ang sensual pleasure over intellectual pleasure. Sabi niya, it cannot promote, no? Utilitarianism should not promote the kind of pleasures appropriate only to pigs or any other animals. No? Yung pleasure kasi ng pigs more on sensual lang, no? Kain lang ng kain, walang pakialam, basta makakain lang. So Mill distinguishes higher intellectual pleasures from lower base pleasures. So we as human beings are capable of searching and desiring for higher intellectual pleasures more than pigs are capable of. On the other hand, we undermine ourselves if we only and primarily desire sensuality. So in other words, ito yung tinasabi ko kanina, no, na mababaw na pleasure, no, momentarily pleasure. Pag ikaw ay natutuwa pag marami kang nakakain, that would be only momentarily. Para according to Milk actually, yung human beings are prone to intellectual pleasures. That's why we have great scientists, we have great inventors, no? We have great lawyers, we have great teachers, among others. Because we find pleasure when we know more about the world and we know more about the things around us. Unlike, for example, other than pig, yung aso siguro, no, gawa ng aso, no? Makakita lang siya ng partner niya sa daan, makikipag-sex na, gano'n, no? Sensual pleasure lang yun, no? That is only appropriate to the animals. They find pleasure in reproducing. Tayo kasi we have our mind, we are rational. And we only do those things privately, no? We don't do it in an open area. And that will be lower base pleasure kahit na gustong-gusto mo nang halikan yung girlfriend mo. Hindi mo gagawin yun sa harap ng inyong pamilya basta-basta unless you are very liberated. No? Dahil that could be a kind of lower base pleasure. Hindi mo ba kayang i-contain? In other words, hindi mo ba kayang pigilan ang iyong sensual pleasure? The sensual pleasure, the urge to reproduce? So that is where the qualitative pleasure differs from quantity or quantifiable pleasure. So Mill recognizes the empirical fact that there are different kinds of pleasures in this statement. Sabi niya, it is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity. So the estimation of pleasure should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. In other words, he is talking about Bentham here. No? Sabi niya kasi, hindi pa pwedeng quantity lang. No? Hindi pwedeng i-equate mo ang pleasure ng isang hayop sa pleasure ng isang tao. Kasi yun yung sa quantity lang eh. You don't ask the question what kind of pleasure is being talked about. Ang pinag-usapan kasi ni Bentham, how how many how does the extent of the pleasure, how is how long is the extent of the pleasure in the human being. Pero kay Mill, he questions what kind of pleasures are preferable when it comes to the quality. Because again, for him, we could not equate human pleasures to that of animal pleasures. So paano natin malalaman ngayon? How do we test pleasure qualitatively? So if the quality of pleasure is sometimes more important than quantity, then it is important to consider the standards whereby differences of pleasures can be judged. The actual test, sabi ni Mill, sabi ni John Stuart Mill, in deciding over two comparable pleasures, it is important to experience both and to discover which one is actually more preferred than the other. So, more on actual preferences and your experience, no? Kasi sabi ko kanina, hindi mo pwede mo i-describe ang experience mo, no? Pwede ka makarinig ng testimony from others, but iba pa rin yung ikaw yung naka-experience mismo, no? So, according to Mill, how do you attain, how do you test pleasure qualitatively? You should experience it. Do you experience more pleasure when not studying or not going to school compared to going to school and studying? Or perhaps kasi meron kasi mga taong hindi pumapasok pero magaling talaga sa skills, na um, magaling sa technical valuation, no, technical stuff, for example. But the point is, no, you have to experience both, which is more preferred by you. Sasabihin ni Mill, most probably, most human beings would choose intellectual pleasures over that of sensual momentary pleasure. So what Mill discovers is that actual choices of knowledgeable persons point that higher intellectual pleasures are preferable than purely sensual appetites. Kasi yung sensual appetite, ano lang yan eh, momentarily lang yan eh, temporarily. So improving his point further, Mill offers an imaginative thought experiment. So Mill asks whether a human person would prefer to accept the highly pleasurable life of an animal while at the same time being denied of everything that makes him a person. Imaginative thought experiment lang ito, no? Para i-prove lang na we actually we are actually inclined, no? Inclined to proceed with the higher intellectual pleasures compared to sensual animal pleasures. Sabi niya, would you accept na tawagin kang baboy o aso, no? While being denied of everything that makes you a person? So Mill recognizes that a few would choose the pleasures of a pig than pleasures of human intellectuality. Kaya nga mas natutuwa tayo pag nasabihan tayo ng, ang galing mo ah, matalino ito, matalino ka, galing mo naman sa ganito, galing mo naman sa ganyan. No? And we are more, hindi naman siguro lahat, no? We are more um, offended, and we say, pag sinabi nila, ang takaw mo, di ba? Ang takaw mo, ang dami mong kinain na, di ba? Mas offended tayo doon. Kasi nga, that would be considered as pleasure pig. No? That depends. Depends. Kunyari, you're talking about eating contest. Na, ang galing mo. Yeah. Sabihin, you have the skill of eating. But the point being is that we would more prefer human intellectuality. Mas matutuwa tayo pag sinabihan tayo, ang talino talaga, ang galing mo talaga. So in the famous quote of Mill's Utilitarianism, we read yung pinaka-famous line ni Mill. Sabi niya, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. Ito yung sinasabi niya kaninang, you have to experience both. Nasubukan niyo na bang maging matakaw? Yung talagang akala niyo sasakit na yung tiyan niyo, puputok na yung tiyan ninyo. Nasubukan niyo na bang uminom ng maraming alak? To the point na hindi mo na alam ang ginagawa mo. So, ano mas pipiliin mo? Although, drinking alcohol, occasionally, it's pleasurable. Pero too much, excessive drinking, that is out of the question. Yung bang hindi mo na alam ginagawa mo. Actually, knockdown ka na dapat eh. Pag hindi mo na alam ang ginagawa mo. Pag too much alcohol. So, utilitarianism is not only about the individual happiness actually or pleasure, but most importantly, the pleasure of the greatest number affected by the consequences of our actions. Hindi ko na babasahin ito. No? But the point is, coming from the individual happiness, your own self-pleasure, no? And sharing this happiness to other people by means of doing good in the community, or at least pertaining to actions that have the same goal as that of the community that you belong to. So utilitarianism actually cannot lead to selfish acts. So it is neither about our pleasure nor happiness alone. It cannot be all about us. If we are the only ones satisfied by our actions, it does not constitute a moral good. If we are the only ones who are made happy by our actions, then we cannot be morally good. In this sense, utilitarianism is not dismissive of sacrifices that produce more happiness for others. Hence, it is necessary for us to consider everyone's happiness, including our own, as the standard by which to evaluate what is moral. Yung proof kanina ng argument ni Meal. No? So utilitarianism is interested with the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. So because of the premium given to the consequences of actions, Mill argues for the moral irrelevance of motive or intention in evaluating actions. So, according to Mill, wala sa equation ang motive at or intention. As long as the end point of your action is for the common good or for the greatest happiness of the most number of people, then your action is justified. Sabi yan dito, no, ilang line lang babasahin ko. So, he who saves a fellow creature from drowning does what is morally right, whether his motive be duty or the hope of being paid for his trouble. In other words, kung inisip mong magligtas ng isang nalulunod, for example, alam mo, kilala mo yung taong na yon at alam mong mayaman siya, tapos tinulungan mo siya with the hope na asahan mo na babayaran ka niya. At yun yung motibo mo kung bakit mo siya tinulungan rather. Sasabihin ni Mill, okay lang yun as long as tinulungan mo siya. He who betrays the friend that trusts him is guilty of a crime, even his object be to serve another friend to whom he is under greater obligations. In other words, for example, meron kang isang kaibigan, no, na meron kang utang sa kanya at meron kang best friend na wala ka namang utang sa kanya. Pero itong may utang ka na kaibigan, nagtatanong tungkol dun sa best friend mo about personal stuff. According to Mill, you are more under greater obligations to the one you are debted to. May utang ka. So for him, yung consequence mo ng action of betrayal is justified. So to speak only of actions done from the motive of duty and indirect obedience to principle, it is a misapprehension of the utilitarian mode of thought. In other words, it's not about duty, no, sa utilitarianism. Ang utilitarian mode of thinking would be as long as the end point, the result of my action would be good, that whatever my motives are, no matter bad they are, is justified. So, si Mill, he goes further beyond one's own happiness and pleasure. No? He applies utilitarianism in politics. Sabi niya, Mill expounds that rights are related to the interests that serve the general happiness. No? Rights are our claim in society. Every citizen has these rights. No? You have the right to life. Yan ang pinaka-common good that we all have. And that is why protecting one's own life, no, is mandated, no, by Philippine Constitution. The right to due process as well, the right to free speech or religion and others are justified because they contribute to the general good. So Mill creates a distinction between legal rights and their justification. So he further points out that when legal rights are not morally justified in accordance to the greatest happiness principle, excuse me, then these rights need neither be observed nor be respected. So for example, yung transportation strike, no, um yung issue on oil price, for example, no. Pag ang isang policy ay hindi na beneficial, I'll just finish this one, no, 11 o'clock na. Just finish this one. Malapit na. Yung oil price hike, for example, pag hindi siya beneficial to the most number of drivers, no, PUJ drivers, then according to Mill, it is morally permissible to counter argue the policy, to protest even, no. Because for Mill, any policy that is unjust or not does not bring greatest happiness to most number of people should not be followed and are therefore not morally permissible. So yun. Mill provides some circumstances in which some moral rights can be overridden for the sake of the greater happiness principle. Going back to the case of wiretapping, it seems that one's rights to privacy can be sacrificed for the sake of the common good. So this means that rights are only justifiable by considerations of greater overall happiness. In other words, yung wiretapping na issue dun sa SAF 44 na case, no? Um, for Mill, it is morally permissible to violate one's own privacy for the sake of the common good, for the sake of safety and order, para maiwasan, or in other words, to implement better policies regarding um, those kinds of interaction with the terrorist groups. So in this sense, no, the principle of utility can theoretically obligate us to steal, kill, and among others. Again, theoretically lang ito, no? Because that is for the definition of utilitarianism. A thought experiment and need not be actualized. Since what matters is the resultant happiness, then anything may be justified for the sake of producing the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So, in other words, when it comes to utilitarianism, it is justified whatever actions you have, whatever, no matter what your intentions are, as long as the endpoint of your action is for the common good, for the greatest number of people, then your actions are morally justified. So that is utilitarianism. Thank you for listening.